Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on the UK Conservative Leadership on Climate. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, paying my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'm Cristina Talaco, the Chair of Coalition Conservation, or C4C, and I will be your moderator. For those who don't know C4C, we are a not-for-profit that debates center-right ideas, advocating for sensible and economically viable actions on emissions reduction. But before we start, I'd like to welcome some special guests who joined us tonight. Firstly, the members of the UK Conservative Environment Network, or CEN. The CEN's parliamentary caucus drives the Green Conservative agenda in Westminster. And we have been working closely together in a joint project that will bring to Australia UK Conservative MPs next year to share their views on environmental and climate policy. I'd also like to welcome our Australian federal MPs, state members of parliament who joined us tonight, our C4C ambassadors and directors. Now, in terms of format, this event will be a conversation held under Chatham House rules. All participants will be muted, but you will have the opportunity to type questions in the Q&A box on your screen. So tonight we have the privilege of hearing from two former prime ministers who will share their personal motivations for exercising leadership on climate. The Honourable David Cameron joining us from Oxford and the Honourable Malcolm Turnbull joining us from Sydney. Now, the UK and Australia have much in common, but when it comes to the climate agenda, we've had a very different experience. In the UK, there has been a strong relationship between the Conservative Party and climate, going back to Margaret Thatcher, and David will give his insights on their history and how he championed it into his leadership. Just to give you some statistics, in the UK, renewable energy has overtaken fossil fuels to become Britain's largest source of electricity in a historic shift, representing now 37% of the British electricity generation. In 2014, coal amounted to 40% of Britain's electricity output in comparison to just 2% last year. But by contrast, 60% of Australia's electricity production still derives from coal, as it's been much harder here to achieve bipartisan support for reducing emissions in the Australian context, as we will hear from Malcolm. So I will kick off by asking David a first question. David, first of all, good morning to you, and thank you for making time for us. It's really a great privilege to have you here. You've described addressing climate change as a natural conservative issue, and you urged the conservative politicians not to leave climate action to the left. Your campaign slogan, which I really like, was vote blue, vote conservative, and go green. So the million-dollar question for an Australian is, how did the Conservative Party establish itself with green credentials, and what steps were taken to achieve that? Was there anything that you had to avoid or focus more on, and was there much opposition, including within the party itself?
Well, thanks very much, and great to be with you. I hope you're hearing me okay?
Yeah.
Great. It's really good to be with you. I mean, it is, I think, a different history in the UK to Australia. I've been listening to Malcolm's book and the history of the difficulties over climate change action in Australia, and it's been a different story here. I think the first thing is I had a good inheritance. As you say, Margaret Thatcher was one of the first leaders to talk about climate change. The Conservative government under John Major was very positive at that important Rio conference. So the inheritance was better, and it wasn't becoming a big partisan divide. That's the first point. I think the second point would be, it was an important step. When I became leader of the opposition in 2005, one of the very first things I said was we were going to lead on climate and we were going to back the government on the climate change legislation. And I think that step made a huge difference in sort of getting the Conservative Party behind action on this agenda and set it up as a more bipartisan issue. And then, you know, in government, the great thing about being in government, you have the ability to get things done. And we did pursue a very strong green agenda. We cut carbon emissions by 40%. There wasn't one magic bullet. We did lots of things in lots of different areas. But at the end of it all, the Climate Network judged that Denmark had the best record over the previous decade in the world, and UK was number 2. So it is doable, it is possible. I think it requires a particular set of conservative inclined arguments to get it done. But it does require some leadership and a bit of bravery. Was there a lot of opposition? Not too much, because I think they could see that there was momentum behind this. 1 or 2 people tried to kick off, but they didn't really manage to build up much momentum.
Thanks, David. I might bring Malcolm into this now. And Malcolm, great to have you here. And thank you again for supporting C4C as an ambassador. As you all know, Malcolm is an ambassador of our organization. And Malcolm, you've mentioned before that the coalition has a good track record on environmental management. And in fact, one of your biggest accomplishments in response to that gas and energy crisis we had was to increase the capacity of Snowy. But when it comes to getting consensus on a nationally integrated policy here in Australia, there's been no bipartisanism like the UK. So based on your experience, what will it take for the coalition here to exercise similar type of leadership that the UK conservatives exercise on climate? And given that there's been more progress, let's say at state level by the coalition governments, in New South Wales we've met Keane, in Tasmania, South Australia, do you feel states can actually push for a federally integrated approach using maybe the national cabinet?
Well, the answer is that the states are making more progress. Christina, you're absolutely right. The problem that we face now, the obstacles that we face for concerted, integrated action on climate and energy, the problems are all political. If we want to have lower emissions, we can have that together with lower prices for electricity, because the renewables backed by storage are the cheapest form of generation. So there is no longer an economic excuse not to embrace renewables, not to cut emissions. What we have, however, is this phenomenon in Australia and in the United States, but not really in the UK, where the issue of climate change and global warming has become a political one, a matter of values or identity or belief. Now, saying you believe or don't believe in global warming is like saying you believe or don't believe in gravity. Okay, so we've got something that should be, as I used to say when I was PM, a matter of engineering and economics, has become dominated by ideology and idiocy. Now, the problem that we have in the coalition, bluntly, is that the right wing of the Liberal Party and much of the National Party, it's particularly a problem in Queensland, have turned this issue into an ideological one, if you can, that's a generous description, and basically are prepared to blow the show up, throw the toys out of the pram, whatever you want to describe it, if they don't get their own way. And they've done that several times now. Now, as David knows, the premise of a political party is that you get a group of people in a room with a range of views and they thrash them out and then go along with the consensus, the majority, if you like. The right in the Liberal Party do not accept that. And this is the fundamental problem. So they operate like terrorists, but obviously without guns and bombs, in the sense that they're saying, if we don't get what we want, we will blow the joint up. And you get similar sort of ferocity from the climate denialists in the United States, who have now, taken over the Republican Party. I mean, you could not get elected. You could not get endorsed at a Republican primary if you took climate change seriously. Now, this is crackers. And so what's going to make it change? Well, I mean, I was hoping Morrison would take a move in the right direction after his surprise election win, because he had enormous political capital. I think the thing that would make the biggest change would be if Lachlan Murdoch changed his mind on it, because the principal amplifier and supporter of climate change denial is the right-wing media, and most of that in Australia belongs to Rupert Murdoch and his family. And as I'm sure David knows, knows the family pretty well, I guess, too, for what, Lachlan is the successor. And for reasons I don't entirely understand, he's more right-wing than his father. So I think that would be the other thing that might change, would be either the reality or the apprehension of a massive electoral defeat. But, you think about it, in 2007, Rudd beat Howard in part on climate, and yet we had the upsurge in climate denialism and the rise of Tony Abbott and so forth that came only a few years after that. So it's very deeply ingrained, and it's a profound problem for our side of politics.
Thanks, Malcolm. So a question for both of you, because I believe that one of the reasons Australian Liberals seem to avoid climate change, amongst many other reasons, is because of its association perhaps with a carbon tax. So Australia is moving to a sustainable future without a tax or an ETS. So David, was this an issue in the UK? And Malcolm, is a carbon tax or ETS a necessity to achieve a more sustainable energy market here?
Well, I think long term, you do need to have a price on carbon, and long term, you do need some form of emission trading system to make things work, and every academic will tell you that. But I'm a very sort of practical conservative, and when I look at what we did, actually the European emission trading system didn't have a big impact. We set a sort of carbon price floor because the prices under the European ETS were dropping too low. But I don't think that was the absolute key to our success. I mean, we made a series of arguments that appealed to conservative inclined voters. We made the responsibility argument that, it's the most conservative thing in the world to want to conserve your planet and pass it on to your children. We made the economic argument that, this is not economic punishment, this is economic opportunity. We're going to create, and we did create, tens of thousands of jobs in green energy and gave Britain the chance to lead the world and export this technology and create whole new supply chains for things like the offshore wind industry, which Britain now has the biggest in the world. I think, as well as the economic argument, I think it's crucial not just to argue about climate. I think if you want to appeal to a broad swathe of voters, you want to talk about plastic in the oceans, you want to talk about everything from the street corner to the stratosphere. You want to talk about the other aspects of conservation and biodiversity, preventing habitat loss, preventing forest fires, broaden the argument. If it's just about climate, I think it's less easy for conservatives to get on board. And then I think there's a vital political argument, which I found worked in my caucus, as it were, which comes in sort of two parts. Part is, look, if the centre-right and centre leave these arguments to the left, it will all be taxes, it'll all be regulation, it'll all be punishment. We've got to grab this agenda and show that it's optimistic, forward-looking, job-creating, and exciting. And I think the final one is bearing in mind, if you want your Conservative Party to survive into the next few decades, young people will punish any party that doesn't make this part of your agenda. So I think those set of arguments are quite crucial. As I said, ETS, carbon pricing, ultimately you're going to have to do those things. But a lot of our success was based on subsidizing renewables, setting up green investment banks, helping people to insulate their homes, all those things which are sort of job creating and positive. And there is a case for looking at the electricity market first, because of course, as we decarbonize our economies, we're going to need a lot more electricity for vehicles, for homes, for everything else. So starting with electricity generation, where we radically cut emissions and really are achieving pretty much the phasing out of coal, that has been absolutely key to our success. Every country is a bit different. Not everyone has to do the same thing. And if it feels like you're just being dragged along purely by an international agenda, that's not great for conservatives either. So find the arguments that work for you, economic, political, and generational, and deploy them.
Well, I agree with everything David said. I'll just add a couple of points. I think emissions trading schemes and or carbon taxes, and they are different, have tended to work better in theory than in practice. You know, with my theoretical hat on, I would say, yes, we should have an economy-wide price on carbon. But that draws a lot. I wouldn't give up on that, but I think a practical, pragmatic, conservative approach would be to say, let's get on with the measures that are going to get the job done and create less political heat. I'd say the real, the thing that we've got to recognise, by the way, is that a carbon price, a carbon tax, was designed on or proposed on the premise that there would be an additional cost to make energy without emitting CO2. In other words, going green would have a price to pay. And so it was a means of spreading that price over the whole economy and doing so in an equitable way. We are now in the position where if we were all shareholders in an energy company in Australia and we wanted to, build, 1,000 megawatts of new dispatchable power, there is no way we would build a coal-fired power station, even if carbon and CO2 and global warming were irrelevant. Even if all of the denialists were right, you still wouldn't burn coal to do that, because the cost of the key fact is that the technology has improved to the point where the cost per watt of photovoltaics is the photovoltaic module is now less than 10% of what it was a decade ago. And, wind is getting cheaper and more efficient, and, storage is getting cheaper. So all of the technological trends are in the favor of renewables plus storage. And so truthfully, if you want to set Australia up to be a cheap energy economy, and who wouldn't want to do that, the way to do that is to get out of coal and in due course gas, and focus on renewables. In our country, David, it would be mostly solar, but naturally, and then the thing is, you've got to make sure you've got the storage. Hence, as Chris mentioned, Snowy Hydro 2.0, which is a huge pumped hydro scheme that I got started when I was PM.
Yeah, so let's touch then on the economic factor, because as you both alluded to, it's an important factor for gaining support from the conservative voters and the party stakeholders. So in Australia, we do have the land, we have the sun, we have wind, and we do have technology to become a large generator and exporter of renewables. We have a huge number of very impressive projects on the pipeline. Just to name a few, for example, we have Quasar Energy with their Wentworth solar thermal power project. They can power 60,000 homes in New South Wales. There's Sun Cable project in the Northern Territory, and they will export renewable energy by undersea cable to Singapore. In the UK, much of the energy, as you mentioned, David, is now from wind farms. Yep. And you mentioned, David, that we need business technology to be at the heart of what we do, and that conservatives can lead on this. So what would you both say then are the economic benefits for this transition from fossil fuels to renewables? And most importantly, what should current Australian MPs keep in mind when they communicate this area of policy?
Well, I think one simple way to put it is to say, look, there's going to be a revolution in renewable energy right across your region. And the only question for Australia is, are you going to be a laggard or are you going to be a leader? So for us, it was very simple. Denmark, Norway, Germany, other countries were all investing in renewables. Did we want to lead the pack or did we want to follow? Did we want to get some of the industrial benefits for ourselves? Do we want others to have them? And so the economic arguments are, get out there. This is going to happen anyway. Be a leader. And with offshore wind, I mean, it's quite interesting in the UK because the price, when I became Prime Minister, it was £150 a kilowatt hour. And people said, compared with the gas price of maybe £50 a kilowatt hour, people said it's never going to be competitive. It's now coming in at £40 a kilowatt hour. So the price transformation's been incredible, but that only happens if you give the industry a kickstart with effectively the long-term contracts we put in place for wind providers in the early days. We're now getting the industrial benefit. I mean, I went to open a vast Siemens blade manufacturing factory in Hull, a pretty depressed part of the UK, and that has led to an enormous range of supply chain, rather like a whole new car industry coming to your country, that suddenly wind turbines, engines, boats to maintain them, all the parts, all the supply chains, the exports that you're going to get from it. You know, so you re-industrialize, actually. You don't de-industrialize by going green, you re-industrialize, but with clean energy and clean energy technology. So it's about making the arguments for being a leader, not a laggard. And I think most conservatives get that. And that's, I think, Australia's opportunity. As you say, you've got a lot more sun than us, but I mean, our solar went from nothing to 13 gigawatts across some, in my book, it's not as good as Malcolm's book, but my favorite statistic is 99% of the solar panels in Britain were fitted while I was Prime Minister. And that was during 6 years. So you can change quite quickly. Yeah. And I think politically, you have to make the argument, look, if we start down this path, yes, it's a bit painful to begin with because there are, you know, some costs on people's bills or some tax breaks that have to be given. But the cumulative buildup of solar capacity, wind capacity, the Green Investment Bank we set up, pretty soon you have a sizable record, rather like Snowy 2.0, you have a sizable record that you can point to and say that this was real and there were real jobs involved.
Yeah, well, if I could just add a little footnote to that. Again, I agree with David. One of the people on the call is a man called Andrew Blakers, who's a climate scientist at the ANU. And if you've read my book, you'll see I give him a great deal of credit for inspiring me to get on with the big pumped hydro agenda. But Andrew has put a message here. He says, Australia is installing renewables, mostly PV and wind, 4 times faster per capita than the UK, EU, Japan, China, and the USA. We're tracking to 50% renewables in 2026. And he asks, if the federal government stands back and does nothing, will get the job done, will the federal government allow this? And, you know, that's a fair point. And I obviously not in a position to answer that any longer, but the truth is that if the best thing the federal government could do is have a policy that integrated climate and energy, like the National Energy Guarantee, which sadly was dynamited or sabotaged and subsequently abandoned. But if you had that, so that the market understood what the rules were, Andrew's right. What will happen is you will get the renewables and the storage built. I mean, there is I think, an important role for government in the planning and also in facilitating some of the bigger pumped hydro projects, because they obviously involve water and, you know, dams and land use. All of that involves a lot of consent from environmental and planning authorities. But, you know, by and large, the technology has now delivered what we want. And really the opportunity, I think, and, you know, I hope that the Morrison government takes this up, is if you want to spend some money to prime the economy after this pandemic, put it into the Green New Deal agenda, which will in effect accelerate the retirement of the old coal-fired clunkers, and with a bit of government subsidy, move us to greener and cheaper energy a little more quickly than we otherwise would.
Yeah. So Malcolm, there's a great opportunity now with COVID. You know, you and I are on the advisory panel of the Million Jobs Plan that was put forward by the think tank Beyond Zero Emissions, and if adopted, that plan could reduce emissions and create employment, modernize the infrastructure that we have. So, but how can we convince our governments to seize the opportunity to incorporate renewables and sustainable practices in the various economic stimulus that are appearing now, so that we have a clean recovery post-COVID? Is there an opportunity now, and how do we convince our government to look at it and embrace it?
Well, I think it's if it wasn't for this ideological problem, this political problem that we face, I mean, it is lunacy, some of the stuff we see in the right-wing media here. I mean, you know, let's not forget the bushfires. You know, when we had the worst bushfires in our country's history, when 12 million hectares was burned, you had the Murdoch press arguing both here and, of course, echoing it in their channels in the United States, so that it had nothing to do with global warming or the fact that, you know, temperatures had been, you know, so much hotter and it set hotter and drier and so forth. It was because of arsonists. And, you know, it took, as you remember, the head of the Rural Fire Service, the chief of the RFS, had to stand up and say that was complete bunkum. I mean, this is the James Murdoch actually dissociated himself from it. But can I, David, can I raise an issue that's Ned Eakins Dorks, I hope, Ned, I haven't mispronounced your name, has put a note up here, which is a really good one, which is about energy security. I mean, one of the issues that a lot of conservatives are concerned about, and not just conservatives, everyone's concerned about, is Australia's reliance on imported fuel, I mean, liquid fuels. I mean, you know, petroleum in one form or another. If you move to electrify transport, of course, and as we should, and I think we will, and that is powered by renewable means, you will dramatically reduce your dependency on foreign imported oil. So that's something that might appeal to some of the national security boffins on the you know, centre right of politics, or even on the right of politics.
Yes, I should have added that into my list of sort of conservative arguments. I mean, you get a lot of the same people in the UK who make arguments in support of farming for food security are sometimes the people who can be a bit skeptical on climate, but actually food security, energy security, those are inherently conservative arguments. It's a big issue in Europe. I mean, because we have our own gas in the North Sea, we are really totally unreliant on, for instance, Russian gas, whereas a lot of European countries are very reliant. And that's a powerful argument in the European context to encourage them to go green. I think it's a very powerful argument. I mean, the Murdoch issue is interesting. I mean, here, you know, they own the Times, the Sunday Times, the Sun, all sorts of, that 36% of newspapers by circulation. But they haven't, by and large, been proselytizing in favor of climate denial. And I wonder whether that's because there was more political consensus here. They didn't see an opening. There was quite a lot of public support for green measures. And you know, we kicked off in 2005 with a green program in opposition and carried into government. And so maybe that gave us the momentum to stop a sort of a press backlash. I think the one thing I would say, though, sort of political advice, is that you do have to be very practical and box quite clever on these issues. We mentioned this already with respect to carbon prices and ETS systems. I mean, we definitely, you know, we move very strongly on offshore wind and on solar and restarting the nuclear program and insulation. But in one or two areas, we did back off. And I'm very frank and open about that. Onshore wind, we're a small island or selection of islands with very high densities. And I judged after a while that, you know, onshore wind had got to somewhere north of 5% of our electricity generation. You know, you were beginning to get big campaigns against turbines, particularly in beautiful areas. And so I withdrew the subsidies, and I make no bones about that. You know, if you want to pursue a green agenda, you've got to sometimes work out which bits are going well and which bits are going less well. Likewise, with carbon capture and storage, I was all in favor of the big projects that we tried. We put a lot of money in. It didn't seem to be getting us a return. It didn't seem to be working. We needed to make savings in government spending, so I cancelled them. The Green Lobby went a bit crazy about that, but actually we were achieving one of the most rapid reductions in carbon emissions without carbon capture and storage. And so, you know, you have to, I think, be practical. And you know, the strength of our side in politics is that we're practical and pragmatic, and we're not too ideological, and we're evidence-based and all the rest of it. And I think you do have to bear that in mind as you go forward.
I think, David, I think you're dead right on carbon capture and storage. When I was Howard's Environment Minister back in 2007, there was a lot of optimism about carbon capture and storage, particularly from the CSIRO, which, as you know, is our premier, you know, government science research organisation. But you know, as with a lot of things, subsequent experience has shown that it just really isn't cost effective. There's been a lot of money spent on it. And it does involve a lot of energy, a lot of steel, a lot of concrete. And, you know, unless it's allied to, you know, enhanced oil recovery or in sort of niche situations, it's really not, it's not the answer. And I think I just think the focus, I mean, we're in a position where we kind of know what the winners are. You know, it is photovoltaics, frankly, as opposed to solar thermal. Solar thermal seems to have been left behind there, but it's photovoltaics on the solar side. It's, you know, large scale wind, especially offshore wind, helps to have a relatively shallow contiguous sea around you, which we don't, that's not something we have in many parts of Australia other than in Bass Strait, really. And so, you know, that coupled with storage gives you very, very cheap electricity. And that's that ultimately is what it's all about. So I think I honestly, you know, I think we've got staring us in the face here in Australia, the opportunity, which is very rare in life, where you can actually, you know, get the money and the box. You know, you can have much lower emissions and you can have much cheaper electricity.
Yeah. Look, I agree with that. I think there are two difficulties coming down the track, though, which is worth thinking about and how they'll be handled politically. The first is, it is easier to decarbonize electricity generation than it is to price carbon and encourage carbon reduction in the home. I mean, you have different climate, but I mean, you know, most of our houses are gas heated, and moving away from, and we're, you know, I'm in rural Oxfordshire. I'm 20 miles from the nearest city, and I'm on the gas mains here. So that's going to be much tougher, much harder to do as we start decarbonizing residential Britain. That's going to be tougher. And I think the second thing it's worth, you know, thinking about politically is, while Extinction Rebellion and Greta Thunberg and everything else has re-raised the profile of this issue, which is a good thing, there's an element of their approach which is sort of impossibilist. You know, she castigates the United Kingdom, and yet, as I tell my teenage daughter who goes on these marches, you know, our carbon emissions aren't lower than 1984, they're lower than 1884. You know, we've done a really good job. We've got more to do. But if the Extinction Rebellions of this world just say everything you've done is hopeless, we're all going to fry and die, and you politicians are utter failures, it becomes much more hard to sustain a political agenda. So I think we've got to think through the difficult decisions to come, and the argument we have with the impossibilists to try and reclaim this as a matter of sensible, practical, pragmatic politics. I think those are going to be big challenges for us.
David, can I, and with Chris's indulgence, can I just address the point about gas? And one of our, viewers or audience, Irva Goldberg, has raised this, and it's a very good point, as has Max Slattery and others. There is, we've got the opportunity to create hydrogen, green hydrogen, by electrolyzing water. Uses a lot of electricity to do that, but the interesting thing about the economics of renewables is that they are zero marginal cost generators, and I mean, we all look at this long-term cost of electricity figure, which is essentially a banker's figure. That's the sort of thing, in one of my former lives, I would have looked at trying to work out whether to finance a wind farm or a solar farm. But once it's built, the marginal cost of generating an extra megawatt hour is literally zero. So there's always going to be, given the intermittency of wind and sunshine, there's always going to be periods where there is a huge amount of electricity at very low prices, and sometimes, as we've seen in our electricity market, even at negative prices. And so harnessing that to make hydrogen, which of course then can be integrated in, obviously can be burnt to create thermal heat, but also is effectively a form of storage. So you create an excess of energy from your solar farm during the day, you make hydrogen with that, and then you burn that and run a typical sort of gas turbine when the sun goes down. But there's also the opportunity of integrating a percentage of hydrogen into the mix of gas that is being used. I don't know what percentage is safe or what percentage is effective, but hydrogen is a big agenda here. And to give the government credit, it is pursuing that. I mean, as we did too when I was PM, but it's an agenda that is very important. The Japanese are particularly interested in hydrogen, and I just think there's going to be a gigantic opportunity for Australia to make green hydrogen, and of course with all of the benefits and substitution for gas that entails.
Great. Well, there's heaps of questions coming from all the guests. We have more than 200 on the line, so I will probably move on to those questions. But before I read them out, I just want to ask.
I've got one.
Go ahead.
Really, Cassie Lieberman, hi Cassie, has said about 10 to 20% hydrogen into gas lines is the prevailing view. There you go. And Jeremy Stone has said it's 10%. So this is terrific. What a fantastic forum.
I heard 20% was the maximum that we could use the existing, pipelines. Otherwise, we have to change them and code them.
Yeah. Okay. Very good.
So you're on the chat box there, are you?
Yeah. No, just terrific.
I'm getting a lot of good suggestions. I found the Q&A thing on my screen now, so I'm
we can actually print it and send it.
And others. I mean, they're good suggestions.
So I was going to say that there's so many questions. What we can do is for those questions that can't be addressed today, I will get a printout and send them to you, David, and to you, Malcolm, and perhaps you can send them back and we'll just reply later via email to everyone, if you do want to do that. So, but before we go on, I just want to ask more of a personal question to both of you, because that's a great opportunity. I don't think I'll have one again. So first of all, I just want to say thank you again for participating, and it's been incredibly, enlightening so far. And you're both extremely accomplished, as we know, and you continue to be very active. Both of you pursuing your goals still, and Malcolm with your book and so on. What do you consider is your biggest achievement during the time you have both been prime ministers? And if there was one thing that you could have done differently, if there is any, during the political career that you had, what would it be if you had a chance to go back in time? You can start, David.
Well, the challenge I faced when I became Prime Minister in 2010 was principally an economic one. We were forecast to have the biggest budget deficit in the world. We'd had a terrible time following the financial crash of 07-08. And so the economic recovery job was the number one task. And that's the thing I'm proudest of, that by the time I left office, we were the fastest growing country in the G8. We'd created over 2 million jobs. The economy was growing very strongly. We got the deficit down to below 3%. I remember making these points to Barack Obama and said, Barack, you and I were the two fastest growing economies in the G8. And he said, yes, David, we're the two best looking horses in the glue factory, which I thought was rather a gloomy way of putting it. I think that was the biggest, that was the greatest achievement. I think one's regrets are always that, on the agendas that you wanted to pursue, that you didn't do more on the green agenda or on the big society agenda of encouraging volunteering and philanthropy and societal action, education reform. These things all moved along, but you always, when you look back, you think on those things where I was making progress, I wish I'd doubled down and done more. Obviously, I've got the whole Brexit issue to think about, and you can read my book, which goes into that in some detail. And I think, my regret that, I think we were going to have a referendum. This was an issue that was coming to a head. I think COVID's proved that once again. The massive sort of EU rescue package that Britain would have found really difficult to sign up to because we were never so keen on this sort of political union. But, you know, could we have fought the referendum in a different way? Could I have got a better deal from Europe? Could I have made my arguments more persuasively? You know, if you lose a referendum like that, you're always going to spend some time thinking about things that could have been done differently. But I'm confident that actually, you know, we're going to be friends, neighbors, and partners rather than members, and I'm confident we'll be able to make it work.
Well, look, I think just in terms of the regrets, again, I've got a few of them in my book. Obviously, there's a few people I shouldn't have trusted, but
I'll add to your list.
David's got a few on his list in that regard as well. But I think, look, I regret not being able to land the integrated climate and energy policy. I mean, you know, and the consequence of not being able to do that, despite, you know, great efforts. I mean, no one could argue I didn't try, and I was, you know, I went about it in as consultative and careful a way as I could. But nonetheless, so that failing to land that is my biggest single regret politically. In terms of achievement, well, there's a lot of, look, I think the biggest social reform that I was able to deliver was obviously legalising same-sex marriage, as David did in the UK. And those are the type of reforms that, you know, happen, you know, once in a generation, if they happen at all, frankly. You know, it's, so that was very important. But, you know, I think basically getting, from an economic point of view, I mean, we had record jobs growth during my time as PM, and, you know, all of that I was very pleased with. But I think in terms of the economic agenda, the most important reform was really getting innovation and science on the agenda, the National Innovation and Science Agenda, which I, you know, I'm kind of working in the, you know, with the consequences of that now as a venture capitalist. I mean, really, that supercharged Australian innovation and the tech sector in a way it had never been before. And as a consequence, you know, we have a culture of innovation, particularly technological innovation, particularly in the cyber security area, which I've been in the news about today with Casada. And that's, you know, that I don't think that anyone else in my party would have driven that agenda, because frankly, they're not comfortable with it. And so that was one of those things where you can say, yeah, I didn't just do something that was going to happen anyway. I actually moved the needle, and in the right direction.
Well, thanks for sharing that with us. And now I'll just go straight to those questions, and I'm trying to filter them very quickly. There's a question from the CN that I suppose can be for both of you. As we work towards COP26, how can Australian and British Conservatives work together to ensure a successful COP and create a platform for conservative leadership that helps to bring international conservatives along with us? Any thoughts, David?
Well, I think it makes sense to, I always found that, you know, the relationship between the British, Australian, New Zealand, Canadian prime ministers, it didn't matter if you hadn't met that many times before. We all seem to hit it off very quickly. Our politics have a lot of similarities, even though we're on different sides of the world. So I think cooperation is a very good idea. And I think we find it quite easy because we have so many of the same reference points. I think when it comes to the COP, we're in slightly different situations. I mean, Britain has, you know, already made its best offer because we've legislated for net zero by 2050. So we've kind of, our argument has been, this was my successor, which shows that this green streak is now hardwired into the Conservative Party. Our approach has been to say, we're going to go to the COP having already done everything we can from a leadership position, rather than to go to the COP with something else to give, which is, you know, that's what we've decided to do, and I can see why. Whereas Australia maybe is in a slightly different position because the debate is still so active. I think one of the things we can do is speak up for the small island states. Many of them are your neighbours. Many of them are members of the Commonwealth, which we still have a great attachment to. And I think making sure there's a sort of voice for the relatively voiceless is something we can do. And it kind of links to the last question. One of the things I'm proudest of is getting to 0.7% of gross national income in overseas aid payments. And that can be used for green schemes, and particularly to help some of the small island states who are going to be most affected. So I think trying to marshal those arguments and shame the rest of the world, particularly China and others, into taking the action necessary by pointing out how these places are going to be affected.
I agree with my learned friend. I concur with my learned friend on all of that.
I'm not the lawyer. I'm not learned. I'm only the. I went to a school the other day and they introduced me. They got it wrong. They said it's the right and horrible rather than the right honourable. So they didn't always get it. They didn't always get it right.
Well, we don't have any. Well, actually,
we know you're a good lawyer. The British government knows that to our cost.
That's all right. Well, in Australia, the honourable is put into inverted commas.
Yeah.
Well, moving on, there's another interesting question here. David accurately noted that young people will punish parties that don't take climate seriously in the future elections. UK conservative youth have driven modern thinking on policy, yet the significant majority of our own meaningful young liberal movement is aggressively opposed to any meaningful action on climate and conservation, and completely ignorant of what fellow young citizens are thinking and activating on. From your time as leader, can you think of why is this so, and what will it mean for the future electoral prospects of our party?
Well, I think
this is a difficult one. I think what we did was we made it not just part of our thinking, but part of our campaigning. We said, vote blue, go green. And in local elections, we talked about cleaner streets and recycling and enhancing parks and public spaces. As I said earlier, the green agenda for Conservatives mustn't be just climate. It's got to be everything and all-encompassing, and make it a campaigning issue, make it something that touches people's everyday lives. The difficulty, as I said, is with the sort of rather impossibilist agenda of Extinction Rebellion, it's more difficult you can't outbid them. In fact, actually, on occasion, you've got to say why some of the things they're suggesting are impractical. And obviously, young people who've got a lot of passion for this might be drawn to the most extreme part of it. So I think we've got to have a practical agenda, but one that is inspiring and one that's down to earth as well as just about climate. I think, going back to that earlier question, things we're proud of. I mean, we created one of the largest marine reserves in the oceans of all time. These blue belts, which we've done around Pitcairn and Tristan da Cunha and Ascension and now St. Helena and all the rest of it. And, this people, because of the issue of plastics and because of the issue of species and biodiversity, young people find this very inspiring. And it's something, Julie Bishop is helping me with this agenda now, but it's something, there's a huge amount that Australia and other countries could do to join in. And I think young people find that inspiring. So, we may not be the uber greens because we're not Extinction Rebellion, but I think we can make this a big part of our agenda.
Yeah, Malcolm, do you have some advice?
I'd agree with that. I think it's important for our side of politics to be seen to take the climate change issue seriously. The problem with the perception that there are influential, indeed, controlling voices in the coalition and in Australia who deny climate change and basically want to keep burning coal and gas. And that is essentially saying to young people, we don't care about your future. It is saying to young people, the planet, we don't care about leaving the planet for you and your children to inherit in a really damaged condition. And so it's really spitting in the face of younger generations not to take this issue very, very seriously and be seen to do so. Now, to David's great credit, and I mean, David actually was quite an inspiration to me when I was opposition leader, which probably led to my being overthrown, David. But anyway, I don't blame you for that. But I thought in terms of where we sit is in centre-right politics. I've always felt that we're very much on the same wavelength, and I've really admired the leadership you showed. Because you see, what you were saying to young people, you're saying, look, we absolutely take this issue seriously. We've got to address it. We're not necessarily going to address it in the same way as the Greens would or the Labor Party would, but we're onto it. We take it seriously. And the problem with our side of politics, the Liberal and National parties, is that too many of our members and their barrackers and amplifiers in the media are basically seen to be not taking it seriously at all. And so that is what I think is very dangerous, because, you look at that last election in the UK, where the Labor Party had a leader that you would think was completely unelectable and was shown to be so. But the parties differed on responses to climate change, but no one suggested that Boris didn't take it seriously. Yeah. I mean, you just could not credibly make that case. You could say he's taking it seriously, but not seriously enough, or his measures are inadequate. Yeah. But denial is deadly, I think. Yes. Younger people.
Can I ask what my reading of Australian public opinion, but from a very, very long way away, is, the bushfires were pretty transformational in if you look at your polling, as far as I can see, the percentage of people concerned about climate change is actually higher in Australia than in many other countries. And yes, you've got a percentage that are deniers that might be higher than some countries, but it's a pretty small percentage. So surely even the self-interested argument for a centre-right politician must be towards making this issue higher up the agenda. That's why I sort of struggle to see why that isn't happening.
I think the answer is it's all to do with the fractionalisation of politics and the way in which the so-called base of the Liberal Party, I'll just talk about the Liberal Party, the base of the Liberal Party is supposedly so much more right to the right of the electorate at large. Yes. That's particularly true in Queensland. The membership of the LNP are much older, much more conservative, reactionary than the people whose votes they need to get to win government. And of course nowadays, because people can basically listen to what they're able nowadays to live in an echo chamber, media echo chamber that basically confirms all their the views, opinions, prejudices, and can give them alternative facts. I mean, the classic example of that is in the United States, where, as Trump, famously said, he could walk out onto Fifth Avenue, shoot someone, and his supporters would still vote for him. And I'm sure he's right. This silo phenomenon with the media has created great diversity, but you no longer have many media platforms. We still have the public broadcasters in Australia and the UK, of course, who are seeking to reach a broad audience. The days when you needed to do that to make money in the media are over. So you can now have a very narrow audience, and that if you are basically telling people that climate change is rubbish, that COVID is a commie plot, that don't be vaccinated, pick, that the world is ruled by giant lizards and the one world conspiracy and the Illuminati, there will be channels and websites. And that'll tell you that. And, I mean, there was a guy I refer to in the book, who's a man called Maurice Newman, who the Australians know who I'm talking about, I think, who was chairman of the ABC. And he was a former chairman of the stock exchange. He'd been chief executive of a, I guess a middle-ranking to small stockbroking firm in his day. He wasn't a titan of industry, but he was a business leader, business figure, and he's a big climate change denier. And I took this up with him once, and he gave me these tracts he downloaded from the internet, which were raving, nutty stuff. Anyway, so I got one of our leading scientists, one of Andrew Blaker's colleagues at ANU, to do a sort of short 1 or 2 pager for him to just explain what it was, because I thought it'd be good for him to know about it, understand it. And I got it sent to him, and he came back and he said, that's the problem with the ANU. This is the Australian National University. That's the problem with the ANU. They're like the CSIRO. They're in the same conspiracy as the United Nations, And this is,
what do you do?
What do you do? This man was chairman of our public broadcaster, our principal public broadcaster.
Right. We have another very interesting question here. Thatcher didn't just support action on climate, she killed coal, which is true. The UK didn't export coal, Australia does. Can someone please provide clarity about how to address the political reality of that issue?
Well, let me address that, because Ted Baillieu has also raised this issue in the Q&A.
Yeah.
Look, the reality is that thermal coal, that is to say coal that is used to make, to burn, to make steam, to make electricity, that is on the way out. And you know what? Our planet depends on it being on the way out. Every country that takes climate change seriously is seeking to transition away from coal. We're in a better position to do it than most because of our enormous renewable resource, which we've discussed earlier. So I think I would not put a cent into thermal coal in this country or any country, because leaving aside the environmental agenda, I think it is literally an industry that is on the way out, and the sooner it's gone, the better. The other type of coal that we export a great deal of, it is actually in many ways much more important, is metallurgical coal, which is a higher quality coal that is burnt in blast furnaces in order to make steel. And so it's burnt to basically drive the oxygen out of iron ore, so that, it goes from being ferrous oxide to iron, and, then it gets further purified to become steel. That is harder to replace, but what is really interesting is the new technology to use for that flux, hydrogen. So in other words, you burn hydrogen and iron ore. The hydrogen attaches to the oxygen in the iron ore, and your byproduct is, wait for it, H2O, water. So that's a great outcome. And I think I would say thermal coal is on the way out, as is metallurgical coal. Thermal coal much sooner than met coal. But honestly, we are kidding ourselves if we think our prosperity is going to be secured by exporting coal. And I recognise all of this has got to be managed. It's got to be planned. It's got to transition. I'm not suggesting you can do things abruptly, but the trend, if you're in the coal business, the trend is not your friend.
Right. Well, I suppose we're running out of time. How are you gentlemen doing with time? Malcolm and David, do you want to keep on answering those questions, or should we?
Happy to take one more, but I can see my daughter who's not doing her online classes, and I need to go and crack the whip. So gently, of course. So I'd happy to do another question.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got one here. I suppose it has to do with manufacturing. From Michael Shah. Australia is going to make more Tim Tam biscuits for trade with the UK. Manufacturing plays a big part for Australia's future, but high energy costs impact manufacturing. Do more people need to walk the factory floors to see the potential? I mean, I guess we're trying to reduce the cost of electricity, but is that, at the moment it's not quite there. So the question is, how do we improve the situation for the big and small manufacturers in terms of energy cost?
Well, Malcolm gave a very good answer by saying, at the end, renewable energy is becoming cheaper and cheaper. But I think it is a difficult issue we're going to have to grapple with, which is, if we raise our own energy costs and just see manufacturing industry exported into countries that have got higher carbon emissions and growing carbon emissions, we're not really solving the global problem. And I think this is an area where obviously we need the international negotiations to succeed, but perhaps we need to do a bit more thinking about that subject and what are the consequences if we can't get those negotiations to conclude successfully. So, I mean, look, we mustn't be glib and sort of say this environmental agenda is easy. I tried to say in some of my answers, there's certainly some low-hanging fruit. There are some great opportunities. There's some easy things to be done. Getting your own government departments to reduce their carbon emissions is a great thing to do. Setting up a green investment bank, as we did, is a great thing to do. There's lots of easy wins, but there's some very tough things coming down the line, and we're going to keep winning these arguments. We're going to have to think about them very carefully.
Great. Any comments, Malcolm?
No, look, I agree with that. I think the good news about the cost of electricity is that it's on the way down, and talked about the trend being your friend or not being your friend. Well, on energy costs, the trend absolutely is your friend, because the cost of PV in particular has got a long way to go south, so that's good. I think the other point is that most manufacturing is not energy intensive, but I think we have a big opportunity here in Australia with photovoltaics, pumped hydro, and the resultant cheap electricity that we could actually get back into businesses that are really energy intensive, like electricity, sort of aluminium, which is often described as congealed electricity. So, I agree with Ross Garner. We could become an energy superpower, a cheap green energy superpower, and the thing that's delivered that is basically the technology is improved to the extent that it is so much cheaper than it was. I mean, there are people walking around, our friends and colleagues in some cases, who still have in their minds the relative costs of energy that were current a decade ago. I mean, that's all out of date. There's been such a transformation that there is no longer any economic excuse not to move on a green agenda in terms of energy.
Thanks, Malcolm. Well, Wayne Smith from the Smart Energy Council is just saying, let's give these guys their own TV show. So I think that's a good idea for the next thing. You should be having your own TV show.
I'm going to reissue my book called Malcolm Turnbull, My Part in His Downfall, after today's call. I didn't realize that. So that can be the paperback edition. Well, it's been great being with you. Thank you very much for having you. I know you're having this vital debate in Australia. We're not complacent here. Conservatives can still lose the plot, but I don't think we will. And we're very keen to work with you guys and try and help forge a sort of sensible, practical, pragmatic green conservatism for the future. Our parties and our countries depend on it. So good luck. Good luck with the rest of the book tour, Malcolm. I'm listening to it at night in bed. I must say, politics in Australia makes our politics look like a teddy bear's picnic. So thank you for the book. Thank you for letting me join this conversation. I'm going to have to go and do a bit of Zoom homeschooling after this. But it's been lovely being with you.
If you can wait for 1 second, David Nixon would love to have to say a proper vote of thanks to you.
Thank you.
If you can be very brief. And also, David, we really hope that you can join the UKCN trade mission to Australia next year to inspire us a bit more. So I'll be in touch with you about that one.
Thank you.
So David, our Vice Chair of C4C, will do a vote of thanks before we close.
Thanks. I'd just like to thank our panellists for their insights and, more importantly, their actions on the environmental leadership. Many of us see environmental management as a key conservative value, but definitely a liberal value. We're developing a good relationship with the UK Conservatives, and we feel actually an increase in exchange of ideas and thoughts can only actually help both our nations. David, thank you for spending the morning with us. We hope you might come and visit us at some stage in person. The leadership you've shown on climate issues and by the Conservatives generally is a great example of something we need to strive for. Your comments on the need to address environmental issues resonates from different angles, resonates well with Australians. Snowy, hydro to the hydrogen strategies are areas where our government's doing well, but a lot of our successes are actually being driven by businesses at the moment. And I think there's a little bit of a loss of focus on what the role between business and government is in this debate. Malcolm, thank you for your persistence on energy and climate issues. There is strong support from members across both the coalition parties to further advance our position on climate and energy policy. And we feel it's very important to address these prior to the next federal election. With the cost of renewables now being lower than traditional fuels, we no longer need to enter in the ideological debates, but can stick to one of science and economics, or engineering, as Malcolm keeps saying. Christina, thank you for your moderation of this event and the leadership of the C4C.
Thanks, David, and I hope everyone felt invigorated with what we heard from David and Malcolm tonight. From our perspective, C4C will continue to do our work, convincing the coalition that climate is something Conservatives must care about. So thanks to all of you who participated. We hope that you can join us at our next events. 1st July, we're thrilled to be launching C4C in Victoria at a webinar with Tim Wilson, the federal member for Goldstein, and Bridget Valens, the Victorian Shadow Minister for Environment and Climate. And at the end of July, we're really happy that we'll be launching the Youth Conservation Group chaired by our Young Liberal Director, Riley Taylor. So please sign up for these events on our website, coalitionconservation.com.au. So I do hope you all enjoyed the webinar. Stay safe, and we hope to see you soon. David, once again, thank you so much for being with us. Have a wonderful day. And for you, Malcolm, stay in touch. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Chris.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, David.
Thanks very much.
Thanks,
Good to see
everyone,
you.
for
Thanks a
watching
lot.
and participating. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.